Why do we really want to stay in the EU? Hello, my name is Rob McConnell, and in this podcast, I aim to answer the question, why do we really want to stay in the EU? It's not an attempt to justify staying in, no. It's more of a question of why are we still in this outdated, over-regulated behemoth of an unwanted European government. I have drawn very heavily on the pamphlet Europe Doesn't Work, published by the Hamden Trust in association with the Freedom Association and written by Professor Tim Congdon CBE, Chairman of the Freedom Association, as well as my own observations. I'm going to tell you about the big lies, the claims that jobs, many jobs, will be lost, about the myths of the EU prosperity, the myth about why EU manufacturers would be seriously harmed by not trading with the UK, and about the other markets we currently do trade with and the ones we could be doing so much more with. I was surprised to read recently about how the EU was failing democracy in the European continent. Greece has only just, by the skin of their teeth, managed to get the money necessary to keep the country going. It was at a huge, terrible cost to the people. We saw the night after night the crowds in Athens, protesting austerity measures being forced upon them by the European Bank, the IMF, and European finance ministers, mainly the German finance minister acting on behalf of Angela Merkel. It seemed that the country that gave the world democracy was being stifled and its people's wishes simply being ignored. Greece owed money, a lot of money, and the financial institutions wanted repaying, especially the Germans. Their behaviour is a good indicator as to how they will treat any country wishing to change or even leave the EU and or the Eurozone. It's ironic that at the end of World War II, the German nation was all but destroyed. It had been carved up by the Allies, Russia, USA and the UK. How the French got a chunk of it is anyone's guess. George Marshall, the former five-star general of the army, came up with a plan that meant that Germany, at least in the West, was rebuilt using American and British money. Britain was hugely indebted to America for war materials and couldn't really afford to do it. In the late 1950s, to enable West Germany to thrive and prosper, and so not be susceptible to the influence of communism, had their debts forgiven. We were still paying for our war loan well into the 21st century. They had, in fact, been given exactly what Greece needed but was denied in 2015. So we can see that today's EU takes its lead from Germany and Angela Merkel. In Tim Congdon's pamphlet, he talks a great deal about the big lie, and that is the one that says if the UK left the EU, 3 or 3.5 million jobs would be lost immediately. This represents about 1/10 of the working population, so even if they were right, which they clearly aren't, the pro-Europeans' argument is simply not based on any truth because their main source of their information actually concludes that there is a case that withdrawal from the EU might actually offer net economic benefits. Don't take my word for it, let me read it to you in full and you can see what I mean. It's a bit long-winded, but it's the one thing a lot of pro-Europeans will throw at any sceptic given the chance. So here we go. Detailed estimates from input-output tables suggest that up to 3.2 million UK jobs are now associated directly with the export of goods and services to the EU countries. This has given rise to the popular concern that some of these jobs might be at risk if Britain were to leave the Union. Opponents of membership, on the other hand, argue that many of the benefits flowing from the increasingly integrated European economic area might still be available even if the UK were to withdraw, particularly since the Uruguay Round Agreement, under the World Trade Organization auspices, has imposed significant limits on the trade barriers that the EU can place on non-members. In conjunction with their potential gains from withdrawing from the Common Agricultural Policy and no longer paying net fiscal contributions to the EU, there is a case that withdrawal from the EU might actually offer net economic benefits. There, told you it was a bit long-winded. However, there are a couple of things we need to be sure of. One, the Uruguay Round Agreement ensures that the EU cannot put in place significant trade barriers. The World Trade Organization wouldn't allow it, and it would cost the EU dearly. Secondly, according to the good Professor Tim Congdon, those jobs that are associated with the EU wouldn't suddenly disappear because those jobs are there because of trade and not because of membership of the EU. Trade would still occur no matter what. We import too much from them for them to stop trading with us. And the most important thing is that we won't have to pay a hefty £55 million a day just to be a part of this elite club. Can you imagine the CEOs of BMW, Volkswagen, Fiat and Renault allowing their very fine cars, vans and trucks to suddenly stop being sold in the UK? I would imagine there would be a huge outcry from those people working in those factories, as they most definitely would lose their jobs. Look around you, in your living room, your kitchen, anywhere really. Look hard at what is there and where it came from. Chances are a large amount would be from China or Asia, some from the EU and maybe a few that were made in the UK. About 1/3 of our exports go to the EU. We export more to the USA than we do to France and Germany combined, and we haven't had to submit ourselves to any political or monetary union with them, or indeed China, Brazil or India. We conduct trade freely with the other nations already and will continue to do so despite our leaving the club. The Liberal Democratic leader, Nick Clegg, remember him? When he was Deputy Prime Minister, said that there were 3 million of our fellow citizens whose jobs rely directly on our participation and role and place in what is, after all, the world's largest borderless single market. There it is, that magic 3 million figure again. It has become a mantra repeated so many times that it is now being hailed as a fact. And as you now know, dear listener, it is a lie, a big lie, a lie that perpetuates more lies. So, going back to the original question, why do we want to stay in the EU? Well, as we know, the EU trades with many countries, up to 160 in fact. They have no political union with any of them. Can you imagine the EU demanding China join the EU to trade with them? That the Chinese must comply with all EU regulations and laws? I could sell tickets for that meeting and get a great deal on the TV rights, so much would be the entertainment value. Would the Chinese observe ridiculous EU laws? Would the Americans? Would anyone? Of course not. Free trade just doesn't work that way. Another falsehood that we hear is that of how prosperous we've become since joining the EU, or EEC as it was. It became the EU in 1993. And if you look back to where we were economically, in 1973, employment was at 24.9 million. 10 years later, in 1983, it was under 23.7 million. So in our first decade as a member, we'd lost over 1 million jobs. So the idea that the EU creates prosperity is simply another big lie. When Tony Blair's government was elected in 1997, Britain's border controls were significantly relaxed so that immigration was encouraged, and we saw workers from all over Europe coming here to work and live. Anyone who dared to say anything, and I mean anything, in opposition to this was immediately declared a racist or a bigot. Who can forget the moment Gordon Brown's microphone caught his comments when a woman challenged him over immigration and he referred to her as a bigot? Tony Blair's policy put him diametrically opposed to the majority of the British public, and we had to get used to a new trendy word, diversity. Councils started offering jobs such as Community Diversity Outreach Officer, with a salary even Wayne Rooney would be proud of. Only one man stood up and shouted from the rooftops in 2008 about what was going to happen when the former communist countries, now accepted into the EU, which was that we were about to receive several thousand migrants looking to work and live, coming to Britain. He was Nigel Farage, and he gave a chilling prophetic view of the UK, and he was immediately branded a racist, but in reality he touched a nerve in the British psyche. Our cities were never going to be the same again. The housing and local facilities in many areas were simply swamped with people arriving who needed housing, medical facilities and schools, none of which was immediately available, and placing a strain on those that were already there. The UK was powerless to prevent it, because the EU wouldn't allow any changes to its rules on the free movement of its peoples. And if this doesn't convince you, dear listener, I suggest you look back over British history, perhaps go back to October 1066, because that's when our national history was formed. We as a people have striven against oppression, overtaxation and unfair systems. Have you heard about Magna Carta, a little-known document that detailed certain rights that are enshrined even in today's laws? But we have also got the dreaded European arrest warrant, which we have seen many times flies in the face of British law. You are not tried before a jury of your peers, you are whisked off to whichever country demanded your arrest, and you have to bear the cost of your stay and any legal assistance. And don't expect a swift hearing, as there is no sense of urgency in these cases, ever. And if you want to look at Elizabeth I and how she had to deal with a foreign power, dictating to her how she was to rule and sending an armada to enforce these dictates, well, we as a nation faced that, and thanks to Drake, saw off that threat. Wellington saw off another threat to Britain from Napoleon. And of course Churchill led us through probably the worst threat to our nation, but without whom Europe would not exist. Our substantial financial institutions need to be free of the overly burdening EU regulations to allow our banks to do what they do best, make money, notwithstanding the past 5 years, of course. Our fishermen and fisheries industry would find a huge demand for fishing vessels, processing plants and markets, just like there used to be back in the 1960s and 70s before quotas. Many fishing ports have become ghosts of their former selves. Many trades have been lost and will need to be recreated. For example, the making of nets and pots will increase, which in turn will need people to learn how to do it. In summary, I believe that coming out of the EU won't cause a terrible economic failure here, because if the EU stopped trading with us and banned our goods, the very people of Europe would see an immediate decline in their fortunes too. Of course, little is heard of the other worldwide markets we would be able to deal in, like China, Asia, Australia, the Commonwealth, and the Americas. Naturally, there will be casualties. There will be far more winners, such as the fishing industry. We see how successfully Norway and Switzerland trade with Europe and are not in the EU. There are even more markets we could enter and prosper in, such as our Commonwealth members, whom we've had to ignore because of Europe. So, dear listener, if you are not sure why you would want to vote no to remaining in the EU, I suggest you pick up Tim Congdon's book, Europe Doesn't Work, as a starter. William Dartmouth MEP has also written a comprehensive book on the EU and how Britain can and will survive out of it. It is also worth a read. My name is Rob McConnell. Thank you for listening to this podcast.